The letter landed on the table between them like a loaded gun, and Alice Yates did not flinch. "You read it," she said. It was not a question. Reverend Caldwell stood on the far side of the table in the back room of his church, his face drawn tight with the particular strain of a man who believed he was delivering righteous news. Outside, the town of Coldwater Creek, Texas, hummed with the ordinary sounds of a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1878. A wagon creaked along the main street. A woman called to her child. Somewhere a rooster had forgotten what time it was. None of it touched the silence inside that room. "The Hargrove family withdrew their interest," Reverend Caldwell said carefully, as though the careful arrangement of words might soften what was actually a condemnation. "As did Mr. Fielding, as did the Prescott boy." Alice kept her chin level. "All three of them. Within the same week, I'm afraid. And you feel the need to tell me why." The Reverend placed his thick hands flat on the table and looked at her the way a man looks at something he has decided is too complicated to be salvageable. "Alice, you are 26 years old. You run that apothecary as though you invented medicine yourself. You argue with Dr. Vance in public. You carry your father's ledger books as though figures on a page are a substitute for a husband's income. You turned down the Hargrove boy because, and I'm quoting his mother directly, you told him his business plan for the cattle expansion had a fundamental flaw in the water rights acquisition. It did. That is not the point." "Then what is the point, Reverend?" Alice asked. Her voice was perfectly steady. It was always perfectly steady, and she had learned that this steadiness, which she had cultivated after her father died 3 years ago and left her the shop in a town full of opinions, frightened certain people more than shouting ever could. "Because if the point is that I am too educated for one man, too direct for another, and too unwilling to pretend ignorance for a third, then yes, I have received the message. Clearly." "The point," the Reverend said with the exhausted gravity of someone who had delivered this speech before, "is that a woman of your situation cannot afford to be so independent." Alice finished for him. The word fell between them and neither of them picked it up. The Reverend cleared his throat. "Your reputation in this town, Alice. I say this with genuine concern for your welfare. Men talk. The sentiment, and I am sorry to be blunt, is that you have been labeled too independent for any decent arrangement. That no right-thinking man would want to enter into a partnership with a woman who what?" Alice interrupted, and for just one instant the steadiness cracked and something raw and furious bled through. "Who knows her own mind, who kept her father's business alive instead of selling it to the first man who offered, who does not need a man to manage her affairs but would like, perhaps, to find one worth sharing them with." She stopped, pulled herself back. "Thank you for your concern, Reverend Caldwell. I believe I'll see myself out." She walked through the door into the bright Texas sunlight, and she did not look back, and she did not cry until she was safely inside the apothecary with the door locked and the curtain drawn, and even then it was only for a few minutes before she washed her face and opened back up for business. That had been on a Thursday. Marcus Hayes rode into Coldwater Creek on the following Monday. She did not know that yet, of course. She did not know that a man had come specifically, looking for exactly the kind of woman the Reverend had just described. She did not know about the letter Marcus had sent to Reverend Caldwell 3 weeks prior, asking for recommendations of capable, independent women in the region who might be interested in a partnership that required genuine courage and real intelligence. She did not know that the Reverend, with his characteristic failure to read any situation with accuracy, had responded by describing Alice Yates as a cautionary tale, and then accidentally making her sound like precisely what Marcus Hayes had been searching for. She did not know any of it yet. She was behind her counter on Monday morning measuring out a preparation of willow bark and dried chamomile for Mrs. Patterson's persistent headaches when the bell above her door rang and she said without looking up, "I'll be right with you." "Take your time," said a voice she had never heard before, and it had the particular quality of a voice that was entirely comfortable with waiting. Alice finished her measurements, wrapped the preparation in brown paper, tied it with string, and wrote the instructions on a label in her neat, precise hand. Then she looked up. The man standing in her apothecary was somewhere around 30, she estimated. He was tall in the way of someone who had grown up outdoors, with the kind of leanness that came from genuine labor rather than deprivation. He wore a dark coat that had seen serious weather and boots that had covered serious ground. His hat was in his hands, which she noted because most men kept their hats on indoors out of habit, and the fact that he had removed it indicated either manners or nervousness. And when she looked at his face, she thought it was probably manners. He had dark hair and eyes the color of good river water, and he was looking at her with an expression she had never quite seen directed at her before. He was looking at her with interest, not the cataloging interest of a man assessing a woman's surface, something more attentive than that. The way a person looks at something that has already captured their complete attention and they want to understand why. "Alice Yates?" he asked. "That depends," she said, "on who is asking and why." Something shifted in his expression, and she realized after a moment that it was suppressed amusement. "My name is Marcus Hayes. I'm from the Cimarron Valley area, originally out of Missouri. I've been traveling for about 3 weeks, and I think I might be in the right place, but I could also be completely wrong, and if I am, I apologize in advance for taking up your morning." Alice studied him. "What makes you think this might be the right place?" Marcus reached into the inside pocket of his coat and produced a folded letter. He placed it on the counter between them, and Alice recognized the Reverend's handwriting immediately, and she did not touch it. "He wrote to you," she said. "I wrote to him first," Marcus said. "I was looking for information about women in this region who might be interested in a particular kind of situation. He wrote back and gave me about 7 reasons why you were unsuitable, which in my experience usually means entirely the opposite." Alice looked at him for a long, measured moment. "Unsuitable for what exactly, Mr. Hayes?" "I own a ranch," Marcus said. "About 400 acres in the Cimarron Valley up in Indian Territory, near the Kansas border. Good land, decent water access, established cattle operation. I have been running it alone for 4 years since my business partner retired to California and my foreman went back to his family in New Mexico. I have 6 hands who work the operation with me, but I need a real partner. Someone who understands books, medicine, land, negotiation. Someone who is not afraid of making decisions and not afraid of being wrong and not afraid of being right when the people around her think she should pretend otherwise." He paused. "The Reverend described you as too independent for any decent arrangement. I thought that was exactly what I had been looking for." The room was very quiet. Alice was aware of Mrs. Patterson's wrapped parcel sitting on the counter between them, and the smell of dried herbs and wood smoke, and the sound of the town outside, and the fact that this man had just said something that no one had ever said to her before in her life. "You are proposing a business arrangement," she said carefully. "I am proposing a marriage," Marcus said, just as carefully. "That begins as a practical partnership and goes wherever it goes from there. I am not proposing to purchase you or manage you or ask you to make yourself smaller than you are. I am proposing to share a life with someone who can actually handle one." He met her eyes directly. "I am told that is asking too much." "By whom?" Alice asked. "By every person I've asked for advice on the subject," he said. Something very small and very careful shifted inside Alice Yates' chest. She did not show it. She picked up Mrs. Patterson's parcel and came around the counter. "I need to deliver this. If you're still here in an hour, I'll hear more of what you have to say." She went out into the morning. He was still there when she came back. The story of how Alice had come to be standing in that Reverend's office, receiving what amounted to a community verdict on her worth, began several years before Marcus Hayes ever came to Coldwater Creek. Her father, Elias Yates, had been an apothecary in the truest old tradition, trained in Missouri and moved west with his young wife and the wagon load of equipment and knowledge that constituted his life's work. He had settled in Coldwater Creek in 1864, when Alice was 12, and the town had still been raw and uncertain, the kind of place that was deciding what it would become. Her mother, Clara, had died of a fever when Alice was 14, and after that it had been just the two of them, and Elias had made a decision that was unusual for the time and that would shape everything that followed. He had taught Alice everything he knew, not because he had no sons, not because he had run out of other options, but because Alice was brilliant and curious and entirely serious about learning. And Elias Yates had been the kind of man who believed that intelligence did not politely confine itself to one half of the human species, just because society found it more convenient that way. By the time she was 18, Alice could compound any preparation in the shop. By 20, she could diagnose common ailments with as much accuracy as Dr. Vance and considerably more patience. By 22, she was managing the books, negotiating with suppliers in San Antonio, and keeping meticulous records that had saved the business twice when competing operations had tried to undercut their prices. Elias had died in the fall of 1875, a bad heart that had been quietly failing for a year before it finally stopped. He had left her the shop, the building, the equipment, a small amount of savings, and a town that was not sure what to do with a woman who owned something and knew too much about it. Alice had decided not to help them figure it out. She simply ran the business. She paid her bills. She kept good records. She helped people who needed medicine and charged fair prices and did not apologize for being capable. What she had not anticipated was how lonely it would be, not for lack of work, not for lack of purpose, but for the deep, specific loneliness of a person who has a great deal to give and no one around them who wants what she actually has. The men who had expressed interest in the years since her father's death had wanted a well-established business, or a wife who would eventually become what they imagined a wife should be, or the version of Alice that smiled and agreed and did not notice the water rights problem in the Hargrove boys' expansion plan. She had known, in some quiet part of herself, that she was not going to find what she was looking for in Coldwater Creek. She had not known what to do with that knowledge. And then Marcus Hayes had walked into her apothecary on a Monday morning and said the one thing she had never expected anyone to say. He had said she sounded like exactly what he had been looking for. That hour she had given him stretched into 2, and then 3, and by the time the afternoon light was coming in at a low angle through the apothecary windows, Alice knew enough to understand that Marcus Hayes was not a man with a hidden motive and a smooth line. He was the opposite of smooth, actually. He was straightforward in a way that was almost jarring, accustomed to saying exactly what he thought and apparently genuinely surprised when this was perceived as unusual. He told her about the ranch, about the 400 acres in the Cimarron Valley that he had bought with his savings after working cattle drives from Texas to Kansas for 6 years. About the business partner named Gideon who had built it up with him and then, at 52, had decided he had enough and wanted to go to California and die somewhere that didn't have blizzards. About the 4 years since, running the operation with hired hands who were loyal but not partners, making the decisions alone, growing the business slowly and competently, and without anyone to share it with. "I don't need someone to cook my meals," Marcus told her bluntly. "I need someone who can read a contract and tell me if it's a trap. Someone who understands medicine well enough to treat a hand who gets hurt when the nearest doctor is a day's ride away. Someone who can keep books that actually reflect what the operation is doing." He paused. "Someone who will argue with me when I'm wrong." "Do you expect to be wrong often?" Alice asked. "Often enough that I need someone who won't just agree with me to avoid a scene," he said. Alice looked out through her window at the main street of Coldwater Creek, where the afternoon was going about its ordinary business. "People will say terrible things about me if I go," she said. "They already say terrible things about me for staying." "I know," Marcus said. "I grew up in Missouri. I know what people say about women who don't fit the available categories." Something shifted in his voice, a careful note that she would come to recognize as the outer edge of something he was not quite ready to say yet. My mother was one of them. She looked at him then, really looked, and he met her gaze and did not look away. I'm not asking you to decide today, he said. I'll be in town for a week. I have business to attend to before I head back north, but I would like to spend more time talking with you if you're willing. Alice considered him for a moment. Come back tomorrow morning, she said. I open at 7. He was there at 7, and the day after, and the day after that. What developed over those days was unlike anything Alice had expected and unlike, she suspected, anything Marcus had quite prepared himself for either. They talked. They talked the way two people talk when they have both been slightly starved for genuine conversation and suddenly find themselves seated across from someone who talks back. He asked her about the apothecary business with real curiosity, not the patronizing curiosity of a man who is pretending to be interested to be polite, but the actual engaged interest of someone who recognized competence and found it genuinely interesting. He asked about her suppliers, about the challenges of sourcing materials in a frontier town, about how she handled situations where people could not pay. She told him about the credit system she ran, the careful records she kept, the quiet arrangements she made for families who were struggling without advertising their difficulties. She told him about the seasonal patterns, about what the cattle drive men needed in spring versus what the winter brought. She told him about the herbs she grew herself in a small plot behind the building, the one she had learned from an older Mexican woman named Señora Vargas, who had been her father's friend and her own teacher in the years after her mother died. Marcus listened to everything. He asked follow-up questions. He took nothing she said and turned it smaller than it was. On the third day, she asked him about his dark past with the business partner arrangement, and he told her about Gideon Marsh with a directness that she appreciated. They had been partners in the genuine sense, equal investment, equal decision-making, equal work. It had been successful, and it had been difficult, and it had been, for a time, exactly what both of them needed. When Gideon had decided to leave, Marcus had experienced it as a loss that was more than just practical. He was the person who argued with me, Marcus said, sitting on the bench outside the apothecary in the evening of the third day, the sky going pink and gold over the Texas plain. The one who told me when I was making a mistake. When he left, I found out how many mistakes I'd been making. What kind of mistakes? Alice asked. Trusting the wrong people, Marcus said. I nearly lost the ranch the winter before last. A man named Caldwell, no relation to your reverend. Different Caldwell entirely offered me a contract for the next season's herd that looked good on paper. I almost signed it. It had a clause buried in the middle that would have given him the right to purchase the land at a predetermined price if the cattle operation failed to meet certain numbers for 2 consecutive quarters. Numbers that he would have had influence over, since the clause also required me to use his agents as middlemen for the sales. Alice went very still. That's a trap, she said. That's exactly what it was, Marcus said. I caught it but barely, and I was up reading that contract at 2 in the morning, and it still took me 3 readings. If I'd had a partner, I would have caught it in the first hour. He looked at her. That's why I started looking. She understood him then. Not just the practical need, but the deeper thing underneath it. The particular vulnerability of a person who has built something real and knows they are not quite safe without someone who sees what they see. What do you know about the Cimarron Valley? She asked. So he told her about the land. He told her about the way the valley sat between the upland plains and the river bottom, about the grass that grew there in the spring, about the way the water ran. He told her about the hands, names she would come to know over the following months. A quiet man named Thomas Reeves who had been working cattle since before the war. A young man just turned 22 named Samuel Cobb who had a gift with horses. An older man named Pedro Gutierrez who managed the day-to-day operations with a calm authority that Marcus relied on entirely. He told her about the house. It was not large, he said, but it was solid, built from stone that he and Gideon had quarried themselves from the ridge on the western edge of the property. It had a real kitchen and a real floor and windows that actually kept the weather out, which he offered as a point of genuine pride. "You built the house yourself," Alice said. "Gideon and I did, with help. It took a full summer." He paused. "I want you to know what you'd be coming to, not a fairy story. A real operation with real problems and real work, but also real ground under your feet that belongs to you as much as to me, and a real life, and a real partner." Alice looked at the darkening sky above Coldwater Creek. She thought about the Reverend's face delivering his verdict. She thought about her father, who had believed in her so completely that he had made her capable of exactly this moment. She thought about the 7 years since his death and the loneliness she had gotten so practiced at that she had almost stopped recognizing it as loneliness and had started calling it independence. "I have conditions," she said. Marcus looked at her calmly. "Tell me." "The apothecary here is sold, not closed. The supply relationship with my contacts in San Antonio is maintained for whatever we establish on the ranch. I keep my own records. I keep my own accounts. My name is on the deed to the property." "Yes," Marcus said without pausing. "Yes, yes, and yes." Alice turned to look at him. "You didn't even hesitate." "Those are all reasonable conditions," Marcus said. "Why would I hesitate?" The breath she let out was not quite steady. "Most men would have conditions about the conditions," she said. "I'm not most men," Marcus said. It was not a boast. It was just a fact, stated in the same way he stated everything, directly and without decoration. And for some reason that plain simplicity was more convincing than any elaborate persuasion could have been. "I know," Alice said quietly. She sold the apothecary to a young man from San Antonio who had trained under a pharmacist and had been looking for an established location. She sold it at a fair price and negotiated into the contract the right to purchase back the stock of specialty preparations at cost, which she would take with her. She packed everything that mattered into 2 large trunks and a collection of crates that represented the medicinal library, the personal records, and the small accumulation of a life built carefully over years. The town of Coldwater Creek had opinions about all of this. They expressed them to Alice directly, to each other loudly, and through the intermediary of Reverend Caldwell, who appeared at the apothecary on Alice's 5th-to-last day in town with an expression of genuine dismay. "You cannot seriously intend to," he began. "I do intend to," Alice said pleasantly, wrapping another crate of supplies. "Alice, you know nothing about this man. He arrived here out of nowhere. He could be anyone. He could have the worst kind of hidden intentions. He checked out with 3 banks and the land records office in the Indian Territory," Alice said. "I sent letters. I received responses. The ranch is real, the deed is in his name, and he has an excellent credit history." She paused, considering. "Better than the Hargrove boys, actually." The Reverend looked pained. "This is not about credit history." "Then what is it about?" "It's about a woman going off alone with a man she met a week ago to the middle of nowhere, to a working ranch with 6 employees and a legal residence," Alice said. "Where I will be a legal co-owner of the property within 30 days of our marriage, per the written agreement we have already signed." She looked at Reverend Caldwell with something that was almost kindness. "I understand that this does not look like a decent arrangement by the standards you are applying, but perhaps the problem is with the standards." She was married in the small church on the edge of town 5 days after that conversation, with 2 witnesses. The young woman who worked at the dry goods store and had always been quietly kind to Alice, and Thomas Reeves, Marcus's hand, who had ridden down from the ranch to drive the wagon back north. The ceremony was brief, and the Reverend performed it with the compressed dignity of a man who had lost an argument he still believed he was right about. Afterward, standing outside the church in the bright spring morning with the wagon loaded and the horses ready, Marcus turned to her and said, "Ready?" "Yes," Alice said, and they drove north. The Cimarron Valley was different from anything Alice had expected, which was itself unexpected, because she had spent the week before her departure reading everything she could find about the region and thought she had prepared herself reasonably well. She had not prepared herself for the scale of it. Texas was wide, but Texas was also settled in pockets and corridors, roads and towns strung along like beads on familiar threads. The Indian Territory they crossed into north of the Red River was something else entirely. The sky was different there, larger somehow, not just wider but higher, as if it had more room to be itself. The grass of the Cimarron country came in waves that moved with the wind in a way that reminded Alice of something she could not quite name. Marcus drove the wagon for the first day, and they talked through most of it, the easy back and forth that had established itself over the week in Coldwater Creek. He pointed out landmarks, explained the terrain, gave her the practical geography of the region with the precision of a man who had ridden it many times. She asked questions and he answered them, and occasionally he asked her something in return, always genuinely curious, never perfunctory. On the evening of the first day they camped at a creek crossing, and Thomas Reeves, who had ridden ahead to check the condition of the ford, came back and reported that it was fine. He was a compact man of about 50 with a weathered face and an economy of words that Alice suspected concealed a great deal of observation. He treated her with the same careful courtesy with which he treated Marcus, which she understood was the highest possible compliment he had to offer. She cooked the camp meal over the fire with the supplies she had packed, and both men ate without commentary, which in her experience of men meant the food was adequate, and when Marcus said "that's good," afterward in a straightforward tone, she understood that it was. "How long have you worked for Mr. Hayes?" she asked Thomas Reeves. "About 3 years," Thomas said. "Since the second season. Came up from Texas with a drive and stayed on." "Did he tell you why he was going to Coldwater Creek?" Thomas Reeves looked at her for a moment with those quiet, observant eyes. "He told me he was looking for someone," he said. "Didn't tell me much beyond that." A pause. "He looks like he found what he was looking for." Alice filed that away. They arrived at the ranch on the afternoon of the third day, and Alice's first sight of it was the stone house sitting on a small rise above the creek bottom, with the barns and working structures spread below it, and the valley opening out beyond. The grass was coming in green with the spring, and the cattle were visible in groups in the middle distance, and the whole thing had the quality of a place that was genuinely, solidly real. The hands came out to meet them. Samuel Cobb was younger than she had expected, with a serious face and a handshake that was firm and respectful. Pedro Gutierrez greeted her in Spanish first and then English, with a warmth and a directness that she liked immediately. The other 3 men, brothers named Clay and Will Dobson and an older hand named Henry Ford, received her with varying degrees of shyness and courtesy. The house was exactly as Marcus had described it, not large but solid. Stone walls that held the cool of the night through the morning. A real floor, planked timber that had been sanded smooth. Windows with actual glass. The kitchen was at the back, with a good stove and sufficient workspace. The main room had a table large enough to work at, and a fireplace built with the same flat stone as the walls. The bedroom was at the far end with a window that faced east toward the creek. Alice stood in the middle of the main room and looked at all of it, and Marcus stood in the doorway watching her look at it, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "It's solid," she said finally. "I told you it was," he said. "You did." She turned to face him. "Show me where you keep the ledger books." He laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh fully, without restraint, and it was a good sound, genuine and warm. He went to a cabinet beside the fireplace and produced a set of ledger books that she could already see from across the room were somewhat haphazardly maintained. "I told you I needed someone for the books," he said, and there was a note of something that might have been sheepishness under the straightforwardness. Alice took the ledger books and sat down at the table and opened the first one. "Make coffee," she said. "This is going to take a while." "Yes, ma'am," he said, with a small smile, and went to do exactly that. The first weeks on the ranch were an education in every direction simultaneously. Alice learned the operation the way she had learned the apothecary, through systematic observation and direct inquiry, and the careful accumulation of practical knowledge. She rode the property with Marcus in the early mornings before the day's work began, learning the geography the way he knew it, not just intellectually but in the body, the feel of the land under the horse. She reorganized the ledger system entirely, which took most of the first 2 weeks and produced, at the end, a clear accounting of the operation's actual financial position that was considerably more nuanced than Marcus had realized. "You're more profitable than you think in some areas and less in others," she told him on the evening she finished, spreading the reworked accounts across the table. Marcus leaned over to look at them, standing close enough that she was aware of his physical presence in a way that she was becoming increasingly aware of, and that she was not entirely sure what to do with. The arrangement between them was careful and courteous and mutually respectful, and she was grateful for all of those things, and she was also aware that there was something building between them that was more than gratitude and more than partnership, and that they were both being very precise about not addressing it directly. "The cattle operation is strong," he said, studying the figures. "The return on the winter grazing is better than I estimated." "Yes. But you're losing money on the feed contracts because you're paying above market price from a supplier in Kansas City. I found 2 alternative suppliers in the territory, one of which could get you within 50 miles at a better rate per hundredweight." She pointed to the column. "Also, the water rights assessment you paid for in 1876 was based on the original filing and doesn't reflect the additional acreage you purchased in 1877. You need that reassessed. Otherwise, you're operating with a legal vulnerability on the eastern boundary that a bad faith neighbor could exploit." Marcus was quiet for a moment, reading what she was pointing to. "How did you catch that?" "I read the original deed and the purchase agreement for the 1877 parcel side by side. The water rights language in the original filing only names the creek frontage that existed at the time of the first filing. The 1877 parcel has an additional secondary stream that isn't covered." He looked up at her. In the lamplight, his expression was something she was starting to recognize, the particular quality of attention he gave her that was different from the attention he gave to most things, more focused, more warm. "I would have been sitting on that vulnerability for years," he said. "Probably until someone tried to use it against you," Alice said. "Like that Caldwell contract," Marcus said. "Like that," she met his eyes. "That is why you need a partner." "I know," he said quietly, and there was something in his voice that was not just about business at all, and they both knew it, and neither of them said anything more about it that evening. But the air in the room was different when they finally went to their separate sleeping arrangements, and Alice lay awake for a while listening to the sound of the valley and thinking about the expression on his face. The crisis came in July. It came in the form of a man named Victor Crane, who arrived at the ranch one morning with a surveyor and 2 men who stood quietly at the edges of things in a way that made Alice immediately alert, and who presented Marcus with a document claiming a partial right of access across the eastern boundary of the ranch property. Marcus read the document. Alice read the document over his shoulder. She was the one who saw it first. "This is fabricated," she said. Crane turned to look at her. He was a large man, prosperous in the manner of a man who had been prosperous long enough to forget that it hadn't always been so, and he looked at her with the specific condescension of a man who had not expected to have to deal with a woman in this conversation. "I beg your pardon," he said. "The filing date on this document is March 14, 1876, Alice said. "The Territorial Land Office in Guthrie was not operational until April of 1876. This document could not have been filed where it claims to have been filed on the date it claims to have been filed." She looked at him steadily. "Additionally, the signature of the notary is Benjamin Cross, who I can tell you from the public record died in February of 1876. He could not have notarized a document in March of 1876 unless he did so from beyond the grave." The surveyor shifted. One of the quiet men at the edge of the situation looked at the other. Victor Crane's face went through several rapid changes of expression. "That may be an administrative error," he said carefully. "It may be," Alice agreed pleasantly. "In which case you'll want to sort that out with the land office before you present any further claims, because presenting a document with those inconsistencies to a court would constitute fraud." She paused. "I assume you understand the implications of that." Crane looked at Marcus. Marcus was watching Alice with an expression that she did not have time to read fully, but she caught the edge of it, and it was the warmest thing she had ever seen directed at her. "My wife is correct," Marcus said. "I'd suggest you take your document and your surveyor and your associates back to wherever they came from, and if you have a genuine claim to territory on my eastern boundary, you bring the paperwork through proper channels with a real notary and a real filing date, and we'll look at it then." Crane left. He did not look happy. He looked, in fact, like a man who had walked into a situation he had assessed incorrectly and was reassessing rapidly. When the dust from their horses had settled, Alice became aware that Thomas Reeves and Pedro Gutierrez and Samuel Cobb had all appeared at various points around the yard during the conversation, and that all of them were looking at her with expressions that ranged from open admiration to something approaching reverence. "That was well done," Pedro Gutierrez said. "It was obvious once you looked at the dates," Alice said. "It was not obvious until you said it," Marcus said. He was standing close to her, and she turned to look at him, and the thing that had been building between them for weeks was very close to the surface now, and she could see it in his face. Not a hidden motive, not a trap, not the complicated calculus of a man who wanted something from her that she hadn't agreed to give. Just a man looking at a woman he was falling in love with and not quite knowing how to say it yet. "Victor Crane will come back," she said, because she needed a moment to manage what she was feeling. "He'll try another angle. We should get the water rights issue resolved before he does." "Yes," Marcus said. He did not look away. "Alice." "What?" "Thank you." She held his gaze for a moment. "That's what partners are for," she said, and went inside to write the letter to the land office. The water rights issue required 3 weeks of correspondence with the territorial land office and ultimately a trip to Guthrie, which Marcus and Alice made together in August, staying at the hotel in town for 2 nights while they worked through the filing corrections with the land officers. Guthrie was a different kind of place than Coldwater Creek, newer and rower, the kind of settlement that was still deciding what it wanted to be, with the territorial government recently established and the streets still producing dust at the slightest provocation. Alice found it interesting in the way she found everything interesting, as a system with its own logic, and she navigated the land office procedures with a patience and precision that produced, by the end of the second day, a corrected filing that properly documented the water rights for both parcels of the Hayes property. On the evening of the first day, sitting in the small dining room of the hotel after dinner, with the summer heat still lying over the town and a lamp burning low between them, Marcus told her about his mother. He had mentioned her once, briefly, in Coldwater Creek. Now, with the ease of 2 people who had spent weeks learning each other's particular languages, he told her the fuller story. His mother, Eleanor Hayes, had been a woman who ran a boarding house in Springfield, Missouri, after his father died when Marcus was 8. She had run it competently and independently, and without apology, managing the accounts and the maintenance and the relationships with tenants and suppliers, raising Marcus and his younger sister Clara alongside. The town had opinions about this, as towns did. Eleanor Hayes had listened to the opinions when she had to, and ignored them when she could, and done what needed doing regardless. "She taught me to keep accounts," Marcus said. "She said a person who doesn't understand where their money is and where it's going is a person who can be taken advantage of, and she refused to be that person." He turned his glass slowly in his hands. "She also told me that the most important quality in a partner was genuine honesty. Not just the honesty of not lying, but the honesty of saying what you actually think, even when it's difficult. She sounds like she was remarkable, Alice said. She was. Something moved through his expression. She died 2 years before I got the ranch. She never saw it. She would have approved, Alice said. Marcus looked at her. Yes. She would have approved of the ranch. A pause, and then, quietly, she would have approved of you even more. Alice felt the warmth of that move through her in a way she had stopped trying to manage or categorize. She let it be what it was. Marcus, she said, yes. I need to tell you something. He waited, giving her space the way he always did. When Reverend Caldwell told me that I had been labeled too independent for any decent arrangement, I was angry, she said, but I was also frightened. Because I had started to believe it might be true. Not that I needed to change, but that the world as I could reach it from where I stood might genuinely not have room for me as I was. She met his eyes. You came and told me that the very thing they called a problem was what you were looking for, and I want you to know that I did not take that lightly. I have not taken any of this lightly. Marcus set down his glass. His eyes were very steady on hers. I know, he said. I know you haven't, and I want you to know that I have not taken lightly what it cost you to come north with me, what you left behind, what you trusted me with. What did I trust you with? She asked, although she knew. Everything, he said simply. Everything you had built, everything you are. The lamp between them was very steady in the still air. Somewhere outside a horse shifted and a door banged in the evening wind, and the ordinary sounds of a territorial town went on around them, but none of it was what mattered at that moment. I think, Alice said, that I am falling in love with you. The words sat between them, quiet and utterly clear. Marcus reached across the table and took her hand, and he looked at her for a long moment with everything he felt entirely visible in his face. All that careful straightforwardness finally turned fully toward this, and said, I have been in love with you since you came back to the apothecary that first morning and said, if you're still here in an hour, I'll hear more of what you have to say. Because you left the door open. You gave me the chance. That is exactly who you are, and I have loved exactly who you are since that moment. The rest of the evening in that small hotel dining room in Guthrie, the conversations they had and the things they said and the particular quality of joy that moved between them, was something that belonged entirely to them, and that Alice would carry as a quiet private treasure for the rest of her life. They rode back to the ranch together in the warm August morning, with the corrected water rights filing in Alice's saddlebag, and something between them that was no longer building toward anything, but had simply and completely arrived. Victor Crane came back in September, as Alice had predicted he would. He came with a lawyer this time, a man from Kansas City named Aldrich who had the sleek, overconfident quality of someone accustomed to operating in places where the opposition had not read the relevant documents. Marcus and Alice received them in the main room of the stone house, which Alice had set up as a working office as well as a living space, with the relevant land documents organized and accessible, and the corrected water rights filing prominently displayed. Aldrich presented a new claim, this one arguing a historical right of access based on a cattle trail that Crane claimed had crossed the property since before Marcus's purchase. It was cleverer than the previous approach. The documentation was real, the notarizations legitimate. The claim itself was plausible on its surface. Alice had spent 3 weeks preparing for exactly this. She had written to the territorial archives in the time between Crane's first visit and this one, requesting copies of all historical cattle trail documentation for the region. She had received them, read them, and found the specific detail that dismantled Crane's claim at its foundation. The Cimarron Trail Survey of 1869 that Mr. Crane's documentation references, she said, setting a document on the table in front of Aldrich, establishes the trail corridor at a minimum width of 40 feet. The access claim your client is making would place that corridor entirely within the Hayes water rights boundary as corrected in the August filing. Under territorial law, A historical trail easement cannot be established within a documented water rights boundary without a separate specific filing that does not exist in the record. She set a second document beside the first. I have the certified copy of the complete territorial easement record for this property. There is no separate filing. Aldrich looked at the documents. He looked at Alice. He looked at Marcus. He looked at Crane. Victor Crane was looking at Alice with an expression that had moved past condescension and was now somewhere in the territory of genuine respect, the unwilling kind that a man arrives at when he has been outmaneuvered so completely that he has nothing left but to recognize it. "Mr. Crane," Alice said, and her voice was entirely pleasant because she had nothing to prove and no anger left to spend. "I understand that the eastern boundary of this property may represent a strategic interest for your operation. If there is a genuine negotiation to be had about legitimate access rights, Mr. Hayes and I are prepared to discuss it. A properly filed, fairly priced easement agreement is something we can consider, but attempts to acquire access through fabricated or misrepresented documentation will not be successful, and I would encourage you to consider whether they are worth your time and legal fees." There was a long silence. Crane looked at Marcus. "You have a formidable partner," he said. "I know," Marcus said. "I may take her up on the negotiation," Crane said. "That door is open," Alice said. Crane and Aldrich departed. 3 weeks later, Crane's lawyer sent a proposal for a legitimate paid easement on a specific narrow corridor on the far eastern edge of the property, timed for seasonal cattle movement. Alice reviewed it, Marcus reviewed it, they amended 2 clauses, and they signed it. It represented a fair arrangement and a fair annual payment, and the complete resolution of a conflict that had begun as a trap and ended as a business transaction. "You turned an adversary into a revenue source," Thomas Reeves said when he heard about it. "The best outcomes usually go that way," Alice said. The fall came to the Cimarron Valley in long golden waves, the grass browning and the creek running lower, and the sky changing to that particular high blue of the plains autumn. Alice found that she loved the ranch in the fall in a way that was specific and rooted, the way she imagined she would feel about a place that was genuinely hers. She had established a small medical operation in one of the outbuildings, with the supplies she had brought from Coldwater Creek, supplemented by orders from her San Antonio contacts. She treated the hand's injuries and illnesses with the competence her father had given her, and word spread along the valley as it always does in frontier country, and she began to see the occasional neighbor or passing traveler who needed attention. Marcus watched this development with something she recognized as the particular warmth of a person observing someone they love being fully themselves. "You're building a practice," he said one evening. "A small one," Alice said. "Nothing like the apothecary." "But it's useful. It's more than useful," he said. "It's needed." She looked at him. "You don't mind the strangers coming through?" "Why would I mind? Some men would." "I am not some men," he said, with the same simple directness he had used to say the same thing in Coldwater Creek, and she felt the same conviction at hearing it that she had felt the first time. She crossed the room to where he was sitting and put her hands on either side of his face and kissed him, and he pulled her close with the particular warmth of a man who has found exactly what he was looking for and knows it. And outside the stone house, the Cimarron Valley went on in its autumn quiet, wide and real and theirs. The winter of 1878 to 1879 was the hardest winter Alice had known. Not in the way of personal hardship, because they were well provisioned and the stone house was warm and the ranch operation was sound. Hard in the way of weather, the kind of fierce plains winter that the old-timers described as something sent specifically to test the character of people who had decided to stay. The blizzard came in January. 3 days of full whiteout, wind that cut through anything, cold that was not just temperature but a physical force with intent. The cattle were moved to the protected lower pasture before it hit, Pedro Gutierrez having read the signs with the accuracy of long experience, and the loss was manageable rather than devastating. But one of the hands, young Samuel Cobb, was caught between the barn and the bunkhouse in the second night, and became turned around in the total white blindness of the storm, and was found by Marcus 3 hours later sitting against the fence line, dangerously cold and beginning to lose his reasoning. Alice worked on Samuel through the rest of that night and most of the following day. Hypothermia was treatable if you caught it before the deepest cold set in, and she had caught it in time, but it required constant attention, gradual warming, close monitoring of the vital signs, and the careful management of someone who kept trying to sleep when sleeping was precisely what he must not do. Marcus stayed in the room through most of it, watching and helping where she directed him, handing what she needed, keeping the fire exactly where she wanted it. He did not get in her way. He did not second-guess her. He asked clear questions and executed her instructions precisely. By morning, Samuel Cobb was sleeping safely, and his color was normal, and Alice knew he would be fine. She walked out of the room and sat down heavily at the kitchen table and accepted the cup of coffee Marcus put in front of her without saying anything for a moment. "He'll be all right," Marcus said. "Yes." She drank the coffee. It was very good, which she noticed because he had learned how she took it in the first week and had never forgotten. "We need a better rope line between the bunkhouse and the barn." "We'll put one up in the spring," Marcus said, "and a proper storm lantern mounted at each end that can be lit from inside." "Yes." He sat down across from her. The early morning light was coming in thin and pale through the east window. His face was tired, the tiredness of someone who had been frightened and was coming down from it. "You saved his life," he said. "The rope line will save the next one," Alice said. "Let's make sure there's a next problem we're better prepared for." He looked at her across the table with all that warmth and directness, and something else that she had seen growing in him since the fall, a settled quality, the particular piece of a person who has found what they needed and knows it completely. "I love you," he said. Not for the first time, not in any specially arranged moment. Just in the morning kitchen after a long night as a simple statement of something true. "I love you," she said back. The same way, completely true. Spring came back to the valley with the urgency of a frontier spring, fast and green and full of possibility. In April, Alice told Marcus she was expecting a child. He went very still for a moment, sitting across the table from her at the end of the evening. Outside, the creek was running high with snowmelt, and the first meadowlarks had come back 3 days before. "Are you certain?" he asked. "I'm an apothecary," she said. "Yes, I'm certain." Marcus rose from his chair and came around the table to where she sat, and he took her hands and held them and looked at her face with an expression so open and full of feeling that she felt the warmth of it like sun after a long winter. "Are you all right?" he asked. "How do you feel?" "I feel well," she said. "Tired in the mornings, but I know what to do about that. I've attended more pregnancies than I can count." "You've attended them," he said. "That's different from having one." "I know," she said. "I'm aware of the difference." He brought her hands up and pressed them against his face for a moment, his eyes closed, and she understood that he was managing something large and quiet in himself. When he opened his eyes again, they were very clear. "A child," he said. "A child," she confirmed. He looked at her for another long moment. "Do you want to send for a doctor, someone to come and stay through the latter months?" "I want Señora Vargas," Alice said. "She lives in San Antonio, and she has more knowledge about the relevant matters than any doctor I have met. I'll write to her this week." "Write to her today," Marcus said. "First thing." She smiled at him. He smiled back, and it was the particular smile she had come to love the most, unguarded and a little wondering, the smile of someone who keeps finding that the life they built has become better than they planned. Señora Vargas came in June. She was 70 years old, small and precise and entirely unyielding, and she arrived with 2 trunks of supplies and a store of knowledge that Alice absorbed with the same hunger she had brought to every other education in her life. The 2 women spent the summer in long conversations about practice and medicine, and the particular wisdom that Señora Vargas had accumulated over 50 years of attending births and difficult cases across the territory. Marcus treated Senora Vargas with the same respectful attentiveness he brought to every person on the ranch whose knowledge exceeded his own in a given area, which was one of the things about him that Alice loved most. He asked her questions about the medicinal plants in the valley, and she answered them at length. And by the end of her stay, he knew considerably more than he had known before. The baby was born in November in the stone house, with Senora Vargas and Marcus in attendance, and the birth was difficult but not dangerous, and the child arrived in the late afternoon in a rush of cold air and lamplight and the sound of the creek outside the east window. A boy, 8 pounds and furiously indignant about his arrival, which Alice decided was a good sign. They named him Elias Marcus Hayes, after her father and his own, and Senora Vargas pronounced him perfect, and Marcus held him in both hands with the careful reverence of a man holding something that has changed everything he thought he knew about his own capacity for feeling. "He has your father's name," Marcus said, not looking up from the child's face. "And yours," Alice said from the bed, exhausted and utterly awake, watching the two of them with a feeling so full and warm it had no edges. "Elias Marcus," Marcus said softly to the child. "That's a name with some weight to it." "He'll grow into it," Alice said. Senora Vargas stayed for another 2 weeks, until she was satisfied that both Alice and the child were thriving, and that the household was managing without difficulty. And then she returned to San Antonio with the promise to come back when needed, and the kind of correspondence friendship that would sustain both women for many years. The spring of 1880 brought a new development that Alice had not anticipated, though perhaps she should have. Word of the Hayes Ranch's medical resources had spread further than she had realized through the previous 2 years of treating neighbors and travelers, and a petition arrived from the growing settlement of Harlan Ford, 15 miles east, asking whether she would be willing to establish a regular clinic day once a week in their town, which had no resident doctor. She and Marcus discussed it over 2 evenings, with the particular pleasure of a conversation between people who trust each other's judgment and genuinely want to think the problem through well. "It's a commitment," he said. "Time away from the ranch 1 day a week, and there's Elias to consider. Elias is 6 months old and thriving and will manage 1 day a week with his father and Pedro Gutierrez and the combined supervision of 6 devoted ranch hands," Alice said, the corner of his mouth curved. "He will be absolutely spoiled rotten by the time you get back each week." "He's already spoiled rotten. Samuel Cobb built him a wooden horse last week. He's 6 months old." "Samuel feels he owes a debt," Marcus said mildly. "The debt is paid," Alice said. "Back to the clinic." "I think you should do it," Marcus said. "I think it matters, and I think you know it matters, and I think you will do it regardless of what I say, so I'd rather be the person who says yes enthusiastically from the beginning." Alice looked at him. "You are the most reasonable man I have ever met." "I try," he said. She began the Harlan Ford Clinic in April of 1880, riding out on Thursday mornings with her supply cases and returning by evening, and it became one of the fixed points of her week, one of the things that made her feel most fully herself. The people of Harlan Ford received her with the particular gratitude of people who had been going without, and she approached the work with everything she had. By 1881, the ranch had expanded to include an additional 100 acres on the northern boundary, purchased from a family who was moving back east after deciding that frontier life was not for them, and the cattle operation had grown proportionally. Marcus and Alice negotiated the purchase together, Alice handling the contract review and the financing terms, while Marcus managed the physical assessment and the livestock arrangements. And the whole transaction went smoothly because they knew how each other worked and trusted the knowledge completely. Victor Crane had become, surprisingly, something approaching a business ally. The easement agreement had been the beginning of a more ordinary relationship, one based on the mutual recognition that 2 operations sharing a region had more to gain from practical cooperation than from conflict. He and Marcus did not socialize, but they did occasionally coordinate on the cattle market timing and the shared maintenance of the access road that served both properties, and this was enough. The hands remained largely the same, which Alice understood as a sign of a well-run operation. Thomas Reeves eventually became the foreman in the formal sense, taking over the role that Pedro Gutierrez had filled informally when Pedro decided at 60 to move to Santa Fe to live with his daughter's family. The farewell they gave Pedro was warm and genuine, and he left with a horse Marcus had specifically chosen for him and a month's extra pay in his pocket. "You will miss him," Alice said to Marcus, when the dust of Pedro's departure had settled. "I will," Marcus said. "But he has family waiting. He should go to them." Young Samuel Cobb, who had grown from a serious 22-year-old to a genuinely excellent horseman and ranch hand over the years, took on more responsibility as Thomas assumed the foreman role. The Dobson brothers remained steady and competent, and a new hand named James Whitmore joined them in 1882, a young man from Kansas who proved to be quick and reliable and eventually became indispensable. Elias Hayes grew up on the ranch the way children grow up in places that are genuinely alive, with the particular confidence of a child who is loved and busy and given real things to learn. He was in the barn with Marcus from the time he could walk, following the operations with the attentive interest of a child who has inherited his mother's hunger for understanding how things work. He accompanied Alice on her Thursday rounds to Harlan Ford from the time he was 4, and by the time he was 6 he knew the names of most of what was in her supply cases and why. In 1883, Alice told Marcus she was expecting again. "Again," he said, and the word carried only pure delight. "Again," she confirmed. "March, I think." This time she sent for Senora Vargas earlier, and the old woman came with the same precision and the same 2 trunks of supplies and the same serene confidence that everything would go as it should. It did. The second child was a girl, born in March of 1884, in the same room and the same lamplight and the same sound of the creek. They named her Clara Eleanor Hayes, for Alice's mother and Marcus's. "2 mothers who deserved better from the world than they got," Marcus said, holding Clara the way he had held Elias, with that same particular reverence. "They're in the right name." "They are," Alice said. Elias, 4½, was brought in to meet his sister and examined her with the solemn attention of a child confronting a new phenomenon, and then looked up at his parents and said, "She's very small." "You were smaller," Marcus said. "I don't remember that," Elias said. "No," Alice said, "you wouldn't." Senora Vargas, who had been watching all of this from the doorway with the expression of a woman who has seen the best of what human beings can do when they try properly, said something in Spanish that Alice translated for Marcus later as roughly, "This house has the right spirit. Not every house does. This one does." By 1885, the Hayes Ranch was one of the most stable operations in the Cimarron Valley. The books were clean and accurate, the land properly documented, the cattle operation well managed, the water rights secure. The clinic in Harlan Ford had grown into a 2-day-a-week operation as the town grew, and a young doctor named Carroll had come to the territory and established a more formal practice that Alice collaborated with rather than competed against. The stone house had expanded twice over the years, a new room added when Elias outgrew the small space off the kitchen, another addition when Clara arrived, and the house now had the feel of a place that had been lived in fully and added to with care, each addition fitting the original construction naturally, because Marcus had built the first part well enough that anything added to it felt like it had always been there. Alice stood one evening in the late fall of 1885 on the small rise behind the house where she sometimes went in the evenings, looking out over the valley in the dying light. She was 33 years old. She had been on this land for 7 years. The grass below her was that particular amber of a plains fall, the creek catching the last of the light, the cattle in the lower pasture moving with the deliberate slowness of well-fed animals settling for the night. She heard Marcus coming up behind her before she heard him, the particular way he moved that she had learned completely over the years. And then he was beside her, and he put his arm around her, and she settled into his side in the way of two people who have learned each other's particular fit. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "I was thinking about Reverend Caldwell," she said. Marcus was quiet for a moment. "I think about him sometimes too." "You do?" "I think about the letter he wrote me," Marcus said. "The one describing you as unsuitable. I have thought since that I owe him a certain gratitude because he described your flaws so specifically that every one of them was exactly what I needed." Alice laughed softly. "My flaws?" "Your flaws as he saw them, your knowledge, your directness, your refusal to pretend to be less, your independence." He paused. "Every single thing he thought was wrong with you was a thing I had been looking for." She turned to look at him in the fading light. He was 37 now, with the marks of the years in his face in the best way, the weathering and the laugh lines and the particular steadiness of someone who has lived exactly the life he chose. "Do you think he ever understood?" she asked. "Caldwell, do you think he ever saw that he was wrong?" "I think some people never revise their understanding of what is right," Marcus said. "But I don't think it matters. What matters is that you didn't let his understanding become yours." Alice leaned her head against his shoulder. The valley spread out below them in the last light, wide and golden and entirely real. "I was frightened," she said, "when he told me I'd been labeled too independent. I was angry and I was frightened, and I had started to wonder if they were right. Not that I should change, but that the world might genuinely not have space for me." "Did I make space?" Marcus asked. She lifted her head and looked at him. "You didn't make space," she said. "You showed me that the space was already there. I just needed to look in the right direction." He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw in his face everything that 7 years had built. The partnership and the trust, and the ordinary extraordinary fact of two people who had found in each other exactly what they needed, and had not wasted it. He kissed her there on the hill above their valley, in the last of the fall light, and it was the same kiss and something more than the same kiss, the way everything between them was always both. The following spring, in 1886, they were visited by an unexpected guest. A young woman appeared at the ranch gate one afternoon, traveling alone, which was unusual enough to bring Thomas Reeves to the house immediately. She was perhaps 23, with the look of someone who had come a long way and was not sure of her reception. Her name was Nora Mills, and she had been in Coldwater Creek. She had heard about Alice Yates, who had left for a ranch in the north 7 years ago with a man she'd known for a week, and she had found the address through the land records, and she had come to ask one simple question. Was it worth it? Alice brought her inside and sat her down and gave her coffee and listened to the full story, which was not very different from her own in its essential shape. A capable woman in a small town. A community with a fixed idea of what was and was not acceptable. A verdict on her character that had been delivered with the confidence of people who had not asked her opinion. She had also received a letter from a man who said he was looking for exactly the kind of woman she had been told she was. "Do you trust him?" Alice asked. "I don't know him well enough to trust him," Nora said honestly. "He seems genuine, he says the right things, but so could anyone." "What does your own judgment tell you?" Alice asked. "Not what people have said. What do you think when you sit with his letters and his history and what you know of him?" Nora was quiet for a moment. "I think he means what he says," she said. "I think he's telling the truth." "Then listen to that," Alice said, "and verify what can be verified. Check the land records. Write to people who know him. Don't take anyone's word for themselves without evidence. But if the evidence is sound and your judgment says he's real, then don't let a town's verdict on your character stop you from the life you want." Nora Mills looked at her. "Was it worth it?" Alice looked around the room, at the ledger books on the shelf and the medical supplies in the cabinet, and the children's boots by the door and the photograph on the mantel that a traveling photographer had taken 2 years ago, herself and Marcus and Elias and the infant Clara, all of them squinting a little in the sun, all of them entirely real. "It was worth every moment of it," she said. Nora left the next morning, having stayed the night in the guest room and eaten breakfast with the family and observed, Alice suspected, everything she needed to observe. She rode south with a certain quality in her posture that had not been there the day before, the particular straightness of someone who has received the answer they needed. Marcus, watching her go, said, "Do you think she'll go to him?" "I think she'll make the right decision," Alice said, "and I think she knows what that is now." The years that followed were the years of building. Not the anxious building of the first period, when everything was being established and the stakes were acute, and every threat required a response. This was a different kind of building. The slower, more deliberate construction of a life that was already sound and was becoming richer, layer by layer, season by season. Elias grew into a serious, capable boy, and then a serious, capable young man, inheriting his father's directness and his mother's precision in a combination that was entirely his own. By the time he was 10, he was keeping a small, separate ledger for the Foal production records, which Alice had suggested as a way to give him real responsibility with numbers, and his accounts were meticulous. Clara grew up as the most outgoing member of the family, with a warmth and a directness that charmed everyone she met, and a stubbornness that her parents recognized with the particular combination of pride and challenge that parents feel when their children demonstrate their best qualities at inconvenient moments. She announced at the age of 5 that she wanted to be a doctor, and neither Alice nor Marcus suggested that this was unlikely. In 1888, Alice received a letter from Coldwater Creek. It was from the new Reverend, a young man named Stevens who had come after Caldwell's retirement, who had heard from his predecessor about the apothecary he had managed to drive out of town with his verdict on her character. He wrote a letter of genuine apology, not on Caldwell's behalf, because he could not speak for Caldwell, but on his own behalf as a representative of the community that had been wrong about her. Alice read the letter twice, then showed it to Marcus. He read it in silence, then he looked up. "How does it feel?" "Strange," she said. "Unnecessary in a way. I stopped needing it somewhere around 1879. But good to have," she thought about it. "It's good to know that someone understood what happened, what the judgment meant, and that it was wrong." She folded the letter carefully. "It doesn't change anything, but it closes something." She wrote back a gracious response acknowledging the letter and wishing the Reverend and the community well, and meant every word of it. In 1890, the Hayes operation extended its relationship with Harlan Ford to include a formal contract for medical services, the first such arrangement in the territory of its kind, with Alice compensated properly for the clinic days and the ranch operation covering her supply costs. Marcus had negotiated the contract himself, taking the same care with her professional interests that she had always taken with the ranches, and when she read the final terms she had looked up from the document and said, "You gave me better terms than I would have asked for." "You would have asked for fair," he said. "I asked for what it was worth." She loved him fiercely for that. By 1892, Elias was 13 and beginning to understand the ranch in the way that required decisions, not just assistance. Marcus began formally including him in the operational conversations, explaining the reasoning behind choices, asking his opinion, treating his judgment with the respect that develops it. Alice did the same with the medical practice and the accounting, because she understood that the next generation of this life would be shaped by what she and Marcus modeled for them. Clara, at 8, already showed the particular fierce intelligence that Alice recognized in herself, along with a gift for languages that she had apparently inherited from the air of a territory where Spanish and English, and the languages of the native peoples she occasionally heard from traders and travelers, all existed in proximity. Alice arranged for her to study properly, writing to a teacher in Guthrie who taught a range of subjects and was willing to correspond with a remote student. The world around them was changing in the ways the world of 1892 was changing. The frontier that had been genuinely wild and uncertain when Alice and Marcus had come to the valley was becoming settled in its patterns. The railroad had come through 30 miles south, which changed the cattle market entirely and required Marcus to restructure their approach to the drives, which they did with the same systematic competence they had always brought to operational adjustments. There were fewer dangerous strangers. There were more neighbors. The valley that had held a handful of operations when they arrived now had 30, and there was a school at Harlan Ford that Elias and Clara attended through the winter sessions, and a church, and a dry goods store, and a small hotel. The Hayes Ranch remained one of the largest and best-run operations in the region, not just in acreage but in the particular quality of how it was managed, and people knew it and said so. And Alice and Marcus both understood that what they had built together was the source of it. One evening, in the fall of 1893, Alice and Marcus sat together on the porch that had been added to the south side of the house 10 years before, with the valley before them and the lamp burning behind them through the window, and the children inside doing their evening lessons at the kitchen table. They were 41 and 45 respectively, and they were both exactly who they had always been, and the life between them had become something so fully real and deeply rooted that it had the quality of the land itself, something that had been here before them and would be here after them, shaped by their hands but larger than any shaping. "Do you remember," Marcus said, "what Reverend Caldwell wrote in that letter?" "Some of it," Alice said. "I didn't read all of it, just the part you showed me. He wrote that you were an example of a woman who had mistaken capability for character, and that any man who approached you would find himself with a partner rather than a wife, and that this was not a suitable arrangement for a respectable man." He paused. "He meant it as a warning." Alice looked at him in the evening light. And he was completely right about every fact in that sentence," Marcus said. "He just had the direction backwards. You are an example of a woman who has exactly the capability and exactly the character. Any man who approaches you does find himself with a partner, and as for the rest," he reached over and took her hand, "there has never been a more suitable arrangement in my life." She turned her hand in his and held it firmly. "I was so angry that day," she said, "when Caldwell told me what they'd all decided about me. I walked out of that church and I went back to the shop and I locked the door and I was so angry." She paused. "And then you came, and you were so," she searched for the word, "clear about what you wanted, about what you were looking for. I had spent so long being too much of something that no one wanted, and you walked in and said that was exactly what you needed." "It was exactly what I needed," he said simply. "I know," she said. "I know that now completely." She leaned her head back and looked at the sky, which was doing its vast plains thing, the stars coming in clear and deep and innumerable above them. "I was afraid for a while that it was too good, that there was a catch I hadn't found yet." "Did you find one?" he asked. "No," she said. "That's because there isn't one," Marcus said. She laughed softly, modest as always. "I mean that there is no trap," he said. "No hidden motive. No dark past that's going to come due at some inconvenient moment. I am exactly what I appeared to be in Coldwater Creek. A man who needed a partner and was fortunate enough to find the right one." "We were both fortunate," Alice said. "We were also both willing," Marcus said. "Luck and willingness. It takes both." Elias appeared in the doorway behind them, framed by the lamplight, at 14 already beginning to have the height of his father and the self-possession of his mother. "Clara wants to know if she can read the new chapter before bed or if she has to finish the arithmetic first." "Arithmetic first," Alice said without turning around, a muffled protest from inside. Elias disappeared to deliver the verdict. Marcus and Alice sat together on the porch in the fall evening, and the valley was quiet around them, and the stars were the stars of the Cimarron country that Alice had come to know as intimately as the land under her feet. And the life they had built together was exactly what they had both been looking for when they had not quite known how to look for it. And it was here, and it was real, and it was entirely, completely theirs. In the years that followed, the Hayes Ranch continued to grow and change with the times, and with the family that inhabited it. Elias took on more of the cattle operation as he grew into his 20s, with the particular competence of someone who had been learning it since childhood, and had the additional advantage of his mother's mathematical precision applied to his father's practical knowledge. He was 20 when he first negotiated a contract independently, showing it to both his parents afterward, and both of them found that he had done it well. Clara, fierce and determined, studied everything available to her in the territory, and made clear that she intended to study medicine properly when the time came. In 1901, when she was 17 and the world had moved far enough forward that such things were not entirely impossible, Alice wrote letters to 3 medical schools on her behalf, using every contact she had accumulated in 20 years of frontier medical practice, and the responses were mixed but not entirely closed doors. Alice herself, in her late 40s, had become something that had no quite adequate name in that time and place. Not a doctor, not a simple shopkeeper, not a farmer's wife. A woman who had built a practice and a business, and a family and a reputation that extended through the valley and beyond it, who had negotiated with lawyers and land offices and suppliers and adversaries with equal competence, who had delivered dozens of children and treated hundreds of patients, and trained several young women in the valley who wanted to know what she knew. Marcus, at 52, was gray at the temples and as direct as he had ever been, and ran the ranch with the particular ease of a man who has learned his business entirely and trusts the people around him. He and Thomas Reeves, both older now, maintained the operation with the shorthand of people who have worked together for 20 years and no longer need to explain their thinking. On their 25th anniversary, in the spring of 1903, their children arranged a small gathering. Not a formal party, because neither Alice nor Marcus were formal party people, but a gathering of the people who had been the real fabric of their lives in the valley. Thomas Reeves and the Hands, the neighbors from along the creek, Dr. Carroll from Harlan Ford and his family, several of Alice's patients who had become genuine friends over the years. Elias gave a toast, which was brief and well-constructed and entirely characteristic of him, acknowledging his parents' partnership with the particular respect of someone who had grown up watching it work. Marcus, when he was asked to say something, said only what was true. 25 years ago, I wrote a letter looking for a woman who was too independent for a decent arrangement, and I found one, and everything I have built since then I have built with her. There is nothing more I need to say about that. Alice, sitting beside him with their daughter's hand in hers, said, "There is one more thing." Marcus looked at her. "He was also exactly what I had been looking for," she said. "He just had the good sense to show up and say so." The gathering laughed, and the spring evening went on around them, warm and full of everything a life well-lived accumulates, the laughter and the history, and the particular deep satisfaction of people who chose well and worked hard and found in each other exactly what they had needed. The Cimarron Valley stretched out beyond the stone house under the wide sky, green with the spring and alive with the sound of water and wind, and the distant movement of cattle in the lower pasture. The house was solid and warm and entirely real, built from the stone of that ground, and the years of 2 people who had come to it as strangers and made it home. Alice Yates Hayes, who had once been labeled too independent for any decent arrangement, stood beside the man who had said that was exactly what he had been looking for, and the life they had made together was the final and complete answer to everything that had ever been said about what she was and was not, about what she could and could not be, about what was and was not possible for a woman who knew her own mind. It was possible. It had always been possible. It simply required finding the person who could see it, and then having the courage to say yes.